And as he sowed, some fell on the path and was trampled on, and the birds of the air ate it up. Some fell on the rock, and as it grew up, it withered for lack of moisture. Some fell among thorns, and the thorns grew with it and choked it. Some fell into good soil, and when it grew, it produced 100-fold. As he said this, he called out, "Let anyone with ears to hear listen." And now from John Nichols, that is. Imagine you are having a conversation with 4 friends and you tell them something that is really important to you. What you have to say speaks to the heart of who you are and what you believe. The first friend takes issue with what you are saying before you express even half of it. The last thing you expected was a debate, but he seems intent on shattering your thought upon the grounds of logical or empirical analysis. The second friend doesn't really hear you at all. He doesn't understand where you're going with the thought because he isn't really listening. It's as if your seeds are falling on rock and rolling right off. The third friend does understand some of what you are saying, but relates it so much to her own particular obsessions that she distorts your thought into her own. In the end, this topic is so important to you that it gets caught up in the thorns and cannot be freed. The fourth friend listens very carefully and asks some questions to make sure she understands what you mean. She then repeats back what she thinks she has learned from you. Finally, after pausing to reflect, she responds in a way that makes you feel truly heard. Her response may not be complete agreement, but she makes it clear that something genuine and important to both of you has passed between you. It would probably be a mistake to characterize the first 3 listeners as insensitive people whom we would rather not have in our lives. At various times, we have all had all 3 of them in our lives, for they are us. We too can spring into debate mode, all too quick to pound a friend's feelings into the ground. We can be magnificently deaf, even to the people we love. We also can become so enthralled with our own issues that we hear everything as a reflection of our own issues, rather than a word from someone else's heart. The truth of our lives is that active listening may not be the mode we revert to most often when we are with other people. It takes an act of self-consciousness and self-discipline to be genuinely with someone else. In the parable, Jesus concludes, "Let anyone with ears to hear listen." But of course, it is not a question of hearing alone. It is a question of being authentically present with minds, hearts, and feelings, and engaged in receiving another person. It's how we want to be. It's not always, may not even often, be how we are. Perhaps the images of this parable will help us to act out of our best selves. And now is a moment for prayer. Let's join together to pray for those in need of our prayers today. In particular, today we are lifting up the field Jekylls as they care for Rich's dad in South Carolina. Now, as Jesus taught us, let us pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And now, our responsive reading, which is number 666. And if you wondered, oh, hang on, I'll get that off there. All right, cool. It's funny, we don't read it a lot just because of the number. But it's okay, it really is fine. We'll be good. Despair is my private pain, born from what I have failed to say, failed to do, failed to overcome.
Be still by yourself. Let me rise to you. Let me reach down into your pain and soothe you.
I turn to you to renew my life. I turn to the world, the streets of the city, the worn tapestries of brokerage firms.
Drug dealers, price stakes, personal things in the bag that leaves a mark.
Rage and pain in the faces that turn from me, afraid of their own inner worlds.
This common world I love in you, as the light of generations who refuse to surrender their humanity in an inhuman world courses through my veins.
From within this world, my despair is transformed to hope.
And I begin anew the legacy of caring.
So, I just got back, some of you know this, I just got back from a road trip that took me through most of the mid-Atlantic states and almost all of the New England states, except for Maine. And I went through this during the rise of the Delta variant. And because of these two things, the traveling and the coronavirus, we were masking on this trip, it's just me and Desmond, quite a lot, much more than we had been lately. In some areas, like in Maryland and Pennsylvania, we seem to be the only maskers. And in other areas, like Burlington, Vermont, we were clearly part of the majority. And in both cases, I could feel that old feeling from just a few months ago, the feeling of being part of a side, of being judged or supported based on our necessarily public position on one of the most burning issues of our day. I mean, it was also different from a few months ago. Donald Trump isn't president anymore. Everybody's on vacation, or wishes they were, or planning one, or just got back. And the heat of the election and the insurrection have dulled a bit. But there it was. Each time we went indoors, the question of which act, masking or not masking, is more patriotic, which act is more heroic, and which should count against the ledger of our loyalties. I have another quote, this one from Abdul Allah al-Mahri, one of the great poets of the Arabic language. He grew up in the 10th century in Syria, and while part of the Muslim faith and tradition in the broad sense, he was frequently accused of atheism, which he denied, and misanthropy, or a cynical view of humanity as a whole, which he embraced. And here's what he had to say. Falsehood hath so corrupted all the world. Never deal as true friends, they whom sects divide. But were not hate humanity's natural element, churches and mosques would have risen side by side. Were not hate humanity's natural element, churches and mosques would have risen side by side. Now, al-Mahri was talking specifically about religion, obviously, but he was also saying something much more generally about human nature, and something we've all been experiencing lately. People, according to him, have a tendency, when left to their own devices in times of difficulty, to turn inward, to divide into small groups, to create falsehoods and narratives about others that legitimate their or our own self-interest. They find reasons to hate or to judge. This is an idea that we are all familiar with. After all, whenever we look at the news, sometimes even when we look at our own lives, we see that human beings, when free to act, are free to access their best selves. Their best selves. But they, or we, frequently seem more willing to access their or our worst selves instead. Drawing the lines of division we have become so used to over religion, or masking, or the vaccine, or elections, or race, which makes things difficult. Because for us, for people from progressive traditions, freedom itself is considered a virtue for society. We believe in freedom of thought and freedom of speech. Because of the positive potential of a free society, we are willing to accept the risks inherent in allowing both small d Democrats and demagogues a place in the town square. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau put it this way: to renounce liberty, he said, is to renounce being human, to surrender the rights of humanity and even its duties. To renounce liberty is to renounce being human, to surrender the rights of humanity and even its duties. However, while that may be good in theory, in the real world we find ourselves struggling between freedom on the one hand and responsibility, those duties, on the other. Because a free society is still a society as much as it is free. It is a community that seeks balance and justice as a group. So we don't get to do everything we want because of the constant question of what is best for all of us together. Now, this connection between rights and duties isn't as clear to everyone as it was to liberal thinkers of the Enlightenment. And so we often fight over duties, over how much of our perceived freedom, like the freedom not to mask, must be compromised for others. So right now in the midst of the chaos, we have a question to answer. And it's not just about masking, which is just the current surface debate of a much larger issue, but about how we resolve the tension between our wants, and society's needs. And the question, the very real question, of how we stay together as a people while we do that. Now those of us in this room, among others, possess a great deal of power to shape the current global discussion, to reshape it from the frantic political culture of fear, blame, and labeling that we see today into something that can be used to address the pressing problems the world is facing. So how do we here today hear the truth in a world corrupted by falsehood? How do we speak it? How do we counter a national conversation that divides people from each other and even incites some people to violence? Now, we aren't going to answer all that in a summer sermon, probably not even in a regular year sermon. But the first step is an approach. It's in an approach that can be seen in John Nichols' endorsement of active listening. Active listening. Now, fortunately, human beings are in fact capable of goodness. We have seen the basic urge of empathy and sympathy manifested in action, and we have seen it in allies and opponents alike. In describing the parable of the sower that we heard today, Nichols notes that it would probably be a mistake to characterize the first three listeners in that parable as insensitive people whom we would rather not have in our lives. He goes on to say that we too can spring into debate mode all too quickly to pound our friends' feelings into the ground. We can be magnificently deaf even to the people we love. The problem is that we don't usually understand where another person is actually coming from. We don't understand fully unless we take the time to hear, and to hear things that may challenge our own self-narrative. The poet W.H. Auden once said, "Not only does humanity create the world in its own image, but different types of humans create different types of worlds." Different types of human beings create different types of worlds. Which is to say that there is a gap between the varieties of lived experience. The Muslim, Christian, and Jew, Democrats and Republicans, women and men, blacks and whites, and people from other ethnicities, people with diverse sexual and gender identities. Even on the individual level, those of us here today who have so much in common have different frames of reference. And this gets in the way of communication sometimes. This gets in the way of peace, progress, and understanding. But active listening, which is what Nichols recommends, active listening is actually sometimes pretty hard to do. Nichols points out that it takes an act of self-consciousness and self-discipline to be genuinely with somebody else. We constantly, in our lives, come up against basic truths from one person or community that do not exist for us. However, I have some news, both good and bad, because listening is only half the conversation, and in some ways, it's the easier part. It can be even harder to speak into the mess and share truth in a way that it can be heard. After all, many of us here are quite comfortable letting people know how we feel. I know this because you let me know how you feel. But how good are we at debating and arguing with others while validating their humanity, even as we counter their opinions or stand by our own? How good are we at hearing and speaking, and then hearing again in times of disagreement? Everyone has a dual role in true dialogue. You see, we are all sowers too. Therefore, in the language of our parable today, the challenge exists just as much for the speaker as for the crowd of witnesses. Jesus says in the Gospel of Luke that a sower went out to sow his seed, and as he sowed, some fell on the path and was trampled by the birds of the air, and some fell on the rock, and as it grew up, it withered for lack of moisture. Some fell among thorns, and thorns grew with it and choked it. And then some fell into good soil, and when it grew, it produced 100-fold. Now, if you do the math, and if Jesus here is speaking of himself, and I believe at least in part he is, then Jesus is only batting .250. No matter how kind and sympathetic, how forgiving he is to his interlocutors. Still, of course, we can learn from his example, because he keeps on speaking and teaching with that average. He keeps on hearing. He stays in conversation, even though even he is only reaching a quarter of the people. And even though, more often than not, the message fails to penetrate, he sticks with the program. He sticks with his program. And we need to stick with the program too. We need to have the ears to hear the diverse voices around us and have a voice of tolerance and reason that the world needs to hear today. So let's take a moment now to pray for the vision and the energy to be part of the conversation, both speaker and hearer, both as teacher and as student. Blessed be. Let us now sing our final hymn, hymn number 121, We'll Build a Land. Please rise. Hidden in all stories is the one story. The more we listen, the clearer that story becomes. Our true identity, who we are, why we are here, what sustains us, is in this story. Rachel, Naomi, Remian. This concludes our service. This is a Lookout Hangout Day, and if anyone wants to go, we can talk about it outside.